All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Alfredo Quesada. Classic toxicology links dose and hazard to outward symptoms. So things like liver failure from acetaminophen, neurotoxicity from lead. Genetic toxicology steps back one layer and kind of asks, what if the first injury is invisible? A signal lesion, a single lesion in DNA that won't show up as illness for years. Today, I want to kind of trace how those molecular injuries become cancer and how that knowledge shapes regulations, drug design, and everyday choices. So here's kind of how I kind of want to move through the presentation. So it'll be divided into 7 parts. Why genetic toxicology matters. So globally, economically, and even just right here in Colorado, there's 3 key major terms that I feel like are very important. It's 4, but 3 of them are what I feel are very important. A brief history of some pivotal discoveries, main exposure sources, and the chemistry that harms DNA, health outcomes, plus a focused case study on aflatoxin B1, how the body absorbs, moves, and clears genotoxicants, and current exposure limits, new diagnostics, and therapies, ethics, and policies. So kind of the through line or the way it'll move through is, evidence to mechanism to action. And so kind of, I guess I want to start with the working definition. So genetic toxicology studies how chemical or physical agents damage DNA and how that damage evolves into cancer. So you can kind of think of DNA as a sort of recipe card, and you have that recipe card and you can smudge it, or you get a couple spills on it, but you can still bake whatever you're baking, the cookies. So if the DNA is the recipe card, it can take a couple hits. But if you get consecutive daily hits or blurs to this recipe card, it's going to hinder it. So if repair enzymes miss those blurs, the cell bakes the wrong recipe. You get uncontrolled cellular growth. Across cancers mapped by the Cancer Genome Atlas, about 45% of driver mutations carry mutational signatures from known genetic genotoxic agents. Things kind of like tobacco, UV radiation, aflatoxin, alkylating drugs. So nearly half the oncology burden starts or begins with preventable DNA injury. And that kind of leads to like a bigger overarching question. Why should anyone outside a molecular lab really care? And I think it's important to connect molecular damage to real world stakes, global to local. So as far as like a global scale goes, cancer is now the second leading cause of death worldwide, and DNA damage is a common starting point. Preventing that first hit means preventing a third of all cancers. It's huge. And on an economic scale, U.S. cancer care exceeded $210 billion last year. That's almost the GDP of New Zealand. It's huge. So prevention isn't just, good medicine. It's also good economics. As far as like a Colorado snapshot goes, radon accumulates in about 1 of every 2 front range homes, and it's linked to about 500 lung cancer deaths per year. It's a lot. And then benzene from oil and gas sites, so the burn off, OSHA limits that to 1 part per million in an 8-hour working day because chronic exposure drives leukemia. And here in Colorado, we face high altitude UV, so we get a high impact of UV radiation from the sun, and wildfire, polycyclic, the PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, I believe. It adds daily DNA stress to skin and lungs. So I guess the main purpose in saying this is by tracing the chain from exposure to DNA damage to mutation to cancer, you can engineer or make safer chemicals, justify evidence-based exposure limits, and recommend practical steps, things that people can actually do, like a $30 radon test for on-site. In short, genetic toxicology turns molecular events into actions that save lives and money globally, and here too, here at home. And I think to keep the rest of the discussion moving, I think this is where, those three, key terms and labels kind of come in. And I say three, but I know there's four, but three main. So carcinogen, confirmed cancer causers. Genotoxicants, they're agents that damage genetic material that can potentially lead to these mutations. Things like chemicals, radiation, and specific biological toxins. And then you got mutagen, genotoxicant that actually changes the base sequence. So they're mutations that may contribute to cancer if they affect key genes controlling that cell growth. And many substances, live for years in a gray zone, and they call them probable carcinogen. So it's positive in animals, but kind of gray line, like inconclusive with people. And a lot of regulatory debate really takes place there. And so we can kind of see how our tools for spotting these hazards, come together. And that kind of segues into, these are some historical milestones in genetic toxicology that I think are really important. So there's the, in 1775, it was Percival Pott. He reports 44 chimney sweep apprentices with scrotal cancer, and this was kind of the first occupational cancer data set that we had at the time. And then kind of coming up to 1940s, it was a mustard gas study. So blood smears from casualties reveal visible chromosome breaks. And then fast forward to 1970s when the Ames test kind of came out. So Bruce Ames, his bacterial mutagen test spread so fast that within 5 years, every major U.S. chemical company was now screening, 500 compounds per year, a ton. And now, to more recent 2020s, CRISPR pool screens. So now we can measure mutation rate shifts down to 10 to, I think it was 10 to the negative 6 per base. So each advance shortens that path from suspicion to proof and to prevention. And then armed with these tools, scientists mapped the main exposure sources. So there's four big main sources of these genotoxicants. So for lifestyle, everyday life, you got smoking, heavy drinking, and what's crazy is in the research that I was doing, I even found that charred meats can actually be a part of this as well. And then number 2, environmental pollution. So wildfire smoke, solvent vapors, heavy metal water. And then for the workplace, which I think is a really big one, refinery of benzene, radiology scatter, paint solvents. And then number 4, radiation. So intense UV at altitude and medical CT scans. So indoor biomass cooking, smoke accounts for about 3% of lung cancer deaths worldwide. It's proof that a lifestyle factor in one specific region is an environmental factor in another. So now you can think, once an agent enters the body, what exactly happens to the DNA. And so we listed the main exposure sources. Now we can kind of zoom in on what actually happens once one of these agents gets into the body. So kind of step one, is entry. So maybe we breathe it in, maybe we eat it, maybe it sneaks through the skin. And then step two, liver kind of steps in. So liver enzymes, you can kind of think of them as the body's chemical processing plant. Usually make things safer so we can excrete them, but every so often they do the opposite. So kind of like, for example, they flip harmless looking benzoapyrene from barbecue smoke into a highly reactive form called BPDE. And then from there, step three, the reactive form hunts for DNA. So like the BPDE, it's kind of like super glue. It snaps onto the DNA base, it bends the double helix and sits there kind of like a roadblock. And then that kind of goes into, copying error. So if the cell's repair crew misses that roadblock, so they don't see that specific bend of the double helix, the next time the cell copies its DNA, it guesses the wrong letter. And in my research, the ones that I found, it was usually a G to a T swap. And just one wrong letter in a critical gene repeated over time can be enough to start a cancer clone. And I mean, bottom line, risk isn't just about how much of a chemical we meet. It's about how fast the liver turns it nasty versus how fast our repair team can mop it all up and kind of clean it. And those DNA hits come in just a few classic shapes. And so those, I'll kind of explain those right here. So first, you got the strand breaks. So you can kind of picture scissors snipping one or even both rails of the DNA ladder. And then you got bulky adducts. So that BPDE, the glue, that super glue that I mentioned before, it wedges into a single base and physically kinks the helix. And third, the oxidative nicks. So normal cell metabolism makes reactive oxygen. Those molecules can nick a base called guanine and turn it into 8-oxo-G, which pairs with the wrong partner. And the last one, the chromosome mix-ups, the chromosomal aberrations, but chromosome mix-ups, big chunks of DNA get swapped or lost, like tearing out chapters of a book and taping them back together, but backwards. A standard chest CT, about doubles the number of double strand breaks in a lung cell, which shows how medical radiation slots just right into this. And so, damage happens, but now, we can see how the repair crew that tries to undo it before it, trouble starts. And so the cell runs a 24/7 repair shop. And that's kind of what this is, the DNA repair pathways. So base excision repair. So kind of like the dentist, it drills out a single bad base like that 8-oxo-G and fills that gap in. And then the nucleotide excision repair, kind of like it's kind of like the body shop. It removes a short stretch around a bulky adduct, great for UV sunburn. And then mismatch repair, it's kind of like the one that goes in. It's the proofreader. It scans freshly copied DNA for typos the polymerase missed. Double strand break repair, it kind of goes two ways. So the homologous, the recombination is the gold standard, using the twin copy of the chromosome as a template. Non-homologous end joining just glues the ends together. Fast, but kind of sloppy though. If the BRCA1 is missing, that gold standard path collapses, which is why, BRCA mutant tumors are so sensitive to PARP inhibitors that block that backup path. And now when this like repair crew falls behind, or a hit is just way too severe, specific cancers start to show up, in clinic. And here are kind of four clear pairs. So the radon plus wildfire smoke, mostly lung cancers, often with KRAS mutations, benzene or high medical radiation doses, you get your leukemias. We literally see the same chromosome swap, the 8 to 21, in a lot of the benzene cases that I read. Aflatoxin with hepatitis B infection, liver cancer, especially in parts of Africa and Asia. But food safety teams monitor it, here too. Aromatic amine dyes, bladder cancer. It's still actually an issue in some manufacturing plants. And you can kind of ask, like, well, what ties them together? Each exposure kind of leaves a fingerprint. The mutation pattern tells us what hit the DNA, like what exactly hit the DNA. But we can kind of dig deeper into the aflatoxin example. It's textbook for how one chemical, one mutation, leads straight to cancer. And that kind of leads me into my case study, the aflatoxin B1 and cancer. So you can kind of imagine peanuts stored damp and warm. There's a mold, Aspergillus mold grows, and that's what makes this aflatoxin B1. Our liver tries to detox it, but the CYP enzymes add an oxygen and accidentally make an epoxide. And now, epoxides are highly reactive. So now we have this highly reactive species. That epoxide loves to attach at one spot in the TP53 tumor suppressor gene, codon 249. The cell repairs most of these hits, but some just slip through and flip an arginine to a serine, and it kills the TP53's brake function. Add chronic hepatitis B infection, and the liver is regenerating like crazy, giving damaged cells more chances to copy. So the result, you're thinking like, well, the result, liver cancer rates skyrocket. You can think public health fix, keep grains dry, use cheap mold test strips, vaccinate for HPV. Simple steps. You get these simple steps, but huge drop in cancer rates. So that story also shows why we have to think about what the whole body does with the toxin, how fast it gets in, where it goes, how long it lingers. That's the ADME. And so, the four letters is one big life cycle. So for the absorption, radon slips across lung tissue in seconds. Fat-loving PAHs in grilled food pass through the gut lining easily. Metals being charged rely on transporters. And then, distribution. So blood carries the chemical around. Lipophilic toxins park in fat and liver. You can kind of think of them as long-term tenants just waiting in there. Water-soluble ones stay mostly in the plasma. And then for metabolism, phase 1 enzymes may detox, or as we kind of saw with the aflatoxin case study, they activate. Phase 2 attaches big soluble groups so the kidney or bile can kick them out. And then, it brings us to excretion. Bulky conjugates leave in bile and stool. Small ones in urine, gases like radon, they kind of just get exhaled. But timing matters. Benzoapyrenes, the reactive form sticks around in lung tissue for, if I remember right, I believe it was 18 hours. That's enough for a dividing cell to copy right through it. And put simply, risk equals how much gets in, how nasty we make it, and how fast we clear or fix the damage. With this the ADME, this life cycle in mind, Regulators can translate molecular risk into actual exposure limits. And that's kind of where the next slide is. So the dose response relationship and regulatory metrics. Because direct acting DNA reactive genotoxicants assume no safe threshold, limits sit low. The 4 picocuries per liter, a unit that tells you how much radioactive material, how many atom decays is happening in each liter of air or water. For radon, 1 part per million for benzene. Benzene's EPA slope factor is 0.029 milligrams per kilograms reciprocal, day reciprocal, underpinning an air goal of 0.13 parts per billion. And prevention is great, but I think we still need ways to deal with the DNA damage that's already seeded in a tumor. And you'll see in the next slide, there's 3 names that I feel like are very important on the next slide. It's the PARP inhibitors. They're drugs that block a key repair enzyme. Tumors missing the BRCA repair gene rely on PARP as their last tire. You pull that tire and the cancer just crashes. While normal cells, you keep rolling. And then there's the NRF2 activators, pills and testing that nudge the cell's antioxidant switch, adding extra cleanup crew against daily chemical hits. And then liquid biopsy, a simple blood draw that captures tiny DNA fragments shed by tumors, letting doctors kind of track it like breadcrumbs. It lets them track the mutations or even spot cancer before a scan can. If you keep those definitions in mind, I think it helps with the next slide, or at least it helped me understand the next slide better. So the PARP inhibitors, they add 7.4 months progression-free survival in BRCA mutated ovarian cancer. NRF2 activators aim to boost antioxidant defenses. Phase 2 trials ongoing. And liquid biopsies, they read H2AX and the DNA damage markers from 10 milliliters of blood. So it's great for remote clinics. Science and therapy raise, kind of, when you look at this, the science and therapy raise broader ethical questions. So there we go. Okay, so zip codes within 500 meters of Denver corridors show urinary PAH metabolites 40% higher than city average. So exposure isn't shared equally. And, you can see in the animal testing versus human models, animal testing has been foundational, but it raises tons of ethical concerns. Current trends emphasize developing human-relevant models like organoids and in vitro systems to reduce animal use, but it's really hit or miss when it comes down to transitioning the animal testing into human models. And public health, and I think the one that really stood out was the public health and ethical responsibility. Scientists and policymakers, they have to balance this regulatory actions with ethical responsibility to protect this vulnerable population and kind of promote equitable access to information and interventions for everyone. And it's evidence and ethics feed straight into policy. I think you can kind of take them and lead them into each other. And so for this next slide, connecting science, policy, and prevention. After OSHA dropped the benzene limit from, I believe it was 10 ppm to 1 ppm in 1987, refinery worker leukemia rates fell. It was roughly 50% just within a decade. Colorado's radon vent rule. So we proposed a radon vent rule. It adds about $200 to a new house, so less than your kitchen faucet, and it'll guard families for decades. You know, these policies and regulations that connect the evidence and the science, they really do help with prevention. But even with good rules, big questions kind of still stay open. And this is kind of so known. As far as what we know, DNA damage sparks many cancers. Lab screens are robust. As far as like the unknown, I mean, there really is a lot. But I nailed a couple down to long-term low dose mixtures, high throughput mixomics. So organoid studies show synergy is real, but compound specific. And there really is a lot of unknowns. When I was doing the research for the presentation, I was reading a lot, and the uncertainties, that there's so many. But I feel like there really is a lot that we have established as far as genetic toxicology goes, prevention, and even forming some of these policies that we use today. And there's three major key takeaways for research and action. Genotoxic agents are common, but exposure can be lowered. I think that's really important to understand. And then mapping damage goes to cancer drives. Going to cancer drives, safer chemicals, and smarter drugs. So I think that's also very important. Is cancer drives safer chemicals and smarter drugs. I think being able to map, route, and see the damage and implications that have been done, it helps us in the end game. And then science, policy, and outreach are kind of three gears. If you remove one, progress stalls. You don't progress at all. And they kind of all play a role within each other. And so these are my references. These are just a few of the major references I used, but I did add, for individual slides, I used specific ones where I got the specific information from, and I put those in at the bottom. But these were a couple of the questions. These were kind of just a couple of questions that I had. So what are the biggest challenges in linking environmental exposure to cancer risk? How can emerging technologies improve detection of genotoxicants? What ethical considerations should guide genetic toxicology research? How do regulatory policies impact public health outcomes related to genotoxic exposures? And in what ways can education